Her voice cracked. The orchestra fell silent. And in that moment 300 people in Studio 6 beheld their breath as Dolly Parton's trembling hand lifted from her guitar strings, pointing toward row 3. Jimmy Fallon had conducted over 2,000 episodes of The Tonight Show. He'd seen surprise guests, tearful reunions, standing ovations that lasted minutes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what was about to happen on this ordinary Tuesday night in March 2024. The cue cards slipped from his hands. They hit the studio floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. Because when Dolly Parton stops singing mid-verse, when her legendary voice breaks and her eyes fill with tears, when she whispers a name that only one person in that audience would recognize, you know you're witnessing something that will transcend television. This is not the story of a planned segment. This is the story of the moment Jimmy Fallon's show stopped being a show and became something far more powerful. This is about the night an elderly man in a flannel shirt and a country music icon proved that some bonds can never be broken, even after 50 years of silence. If you want to know how a single moment changed everyone in that studio, including Jimmy himself, stay with us. Because what you're about to discover will restore your faith in humanity. It was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance. Dolly Parton was releasing her 49th studio album, and The Tonight Show was stop number 7 on a grueling 2-week press tour. The production meeting that morning had been routine, 8-minute interview segment, one live performance of her new single, maybe a quick story about her Dollywood theme park if time allowed. Jimmy had interviewed Dolly 4 times before. She was, in every sense, a professional's professional. Always on time, always prepared, always delivering exactly the warmth and wit that made for perfect late-night television. The rehearsal that afternoon had gone flawlessly. She'd run through Mountains of Memory, her new ballad, with the Roots. Questlove had even added a subtle drum fill that made her smile. You boys sure know how to make an old girl feel young, she joked during sound check, her signature laugh filling the empty studio. By 5:30 p.m., Studio 6B was filling with audience members. The usual mix of tourists and New York locals, many of whom had waited months for these free tickets. In row 3, seat 14, an elderly man named Robert Chen sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap. He wore a simple plaid flannel shirt, red and blue checks, slightly faded from years of washing. His gray hair was neatly combed. His face carried the deep lines of someone who had lived a full life, not all of it easy. Robert had not told anyone why he requested these particular tickets. He'd simply marked Dolly Parton on the online form and waited. When the confirmation email arrived 6 weeks later, his hands had trembled as he printed it. His daughter had offered to come with him from their home in Queens, but he'd insisted on coming alone. Some things, he'd told her, you have to do by yourself. The show began with Jimmy's typical high-energy monologue. The audience laughed in all the right places. The Roots played their transitions perfectly. Everything was running like clockwork. At 12:04 a.m., the show always ran late. The stage manager gave the signal for Dolly's musical performance. She walked onto stage to thunderous applause, her white and gold sequined outfit catching every stage light. Her guitar, a vintage Martin D28 that she'd played for 40 years, hung from an embroidered strap across her shoulder. Jimmy introduced her with genuine affection in his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, performing her new single Mountains of Memory, the incomparable Dolly Parton. But what nobody knew, not Jimmy, not the producers, not even Dolly herself, was that this performance was about to be interrupted by a ghost from 1974. The first verse was perfect. Dolly's voice, still powerful at 78 years old, filled every corner of the studio. The Roots provided gentle accompaniment, upright bass, soft drums, a subtle piano line. The audience was captivated, many pulling out phones to record despite the no-recording policy. The lyrics spoke of old friends and forgotten places, of promises made under mountain skies. It was vintage Dolly. Sentimental but never saccharine, specific but universal. Jimmy stood off to the side, as hosts do during musical performances, gently swaying to the music. The second verse began. Dolly's fingers moved across the guitar strings with practiced ease. She was singing about a teacher who'd believed in a poor mountain girl's dreams when nobody else would. She told me I could fly, though I had no wings to show. And that's when it happened. Dolly's eyes, which had been closed as she sang, opened to scan the audience. It was a performer's instinct, that moment of connection with the crowd. Her gaze swept across row 1, row 2, and then she stopped. Not slowed. Not paused. Stopped. Her voice cut off mid-word. Her hand froze on the guitar strings, creating an accidental dissonance that hung in the air. The Roots, confused, continued for exactly 2 more beats before Questlove, sensing something was wrong, raised his hand. The music died. 300 people fell silent. Jimmy's head snapped toward Dolly. His smile faltered. The cue cards he'd been casually holding slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. His mouth opened slightly, forming a silent question. Dolly's face had gone pale beneath her makeup. Her legendary composure, the same composure that had carried her through 60 years in show business, had completely vanished. Her eyes were locked on row 3, seat 14. Her free hand moved to cover her heart. And then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but in the perfect acoustics of Studio 6B, everyone heard it. "Bobby?" The elderly man in the flannel shirt slowly stood. Tears were already streaming down his weathered cheeks. His hands gripped the seat back in front of him as if he needed the support to remain standing. He nodded, just once. Jimmy Fallon, in that moment, did something that broke every rule of live television. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't try to explain what was happening to the audience at home. He didn't make a joke to relieve the tension. Instead, he walked directly to Dolly and gently took the guitar from her trembling hands, setting it carefully on its stand. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The studio remained frozen. Even the camera operators seemed uncertain whether to keep rolling. But Jimmy's producer, in the control booth, made a split-second decision that would define his career: keep cameras running. All of them. "Dolly," Jimmy said softly, his voice picked up by her lapel microphone. "Do you need a moment?" She shook her head, tears now running freely down her face, cutting tracks through her makeup. "I need to go to him," she whispered. Without hesitation, Jimmy took her elbow and helped her down the stage steps. The 4-inch heels she was wearing weren't designed for sudden descents, but she moved with purpose, Jimmy steadying her as they navigated toward row 3. The audience parted like water. People in the aisle seats pressed back, creating a path. Some were crying. Others held phones aloft, capturing this moment that nobody understood but everyone could feel was sacred. Robert Chen hadn't moved. He stood there, this elderly man in his simple flannel shirt, watching as one of the most famous women in the world walked toward him with tears matching his own. When Dolly reached him, she stopped. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Decades collapsed in that gaze, 1974 to 2024, a rural Tennessee schoolhouse to a New York television studio, 2 people who had once meant everything to each other, and then had been separated by the cruelty of circumstance. "You came," she finally said. "I promised I would," Robert replied, his accent carrying hints of his Tennessee childhood beneath the decades of New York living. 50 years ago, I promised." Behind the scenes, in the control booth, the director was frantically signaling to cut to commercial. But the executive producer, a woman who had been in television for 30 years, shook her head firmly. "No," she said. "We're staying live." Jimmy, standing just a few feet away, felt completely out of his depth. This wasn't in any playbook. But his instincts as a human being overrode his training as a host. He gestured to a production assistant. "Bring 2 chairs," he said quietly. "Put them center stage." Within seconds, 2 simple director's chairs appeared under the lights. Jimmy helped Dolly back toward the stage, and Robert followed, moving slowly, his age evident in every step. The audience watched in absolute silence as these three people, a talk show host and two elderly individuals whose story nobody knew, took their places under the bright lights. Jimmy sat in his usual interview spot. Dolly and Robert sat side by side in the guest chairs, close enough that their hands found each other immediately, fingers intertwining with the ease of a gesture performed 1,000 times, 5 decades ago. "Dolly," Jimmy said gently, all pretense of hosting abandoned, speaking as one human to another. "Would you like to tell us who this is?" Dolly took a shaky breath. When she spoke, her voice carried all the Tennessee mountain music that had made her famous. "This is Bobby Chen. We met in 1974, when I was doing a small tour through East Tennessee. He was a music teacher at the high school in Greenville." She looked at Robert, her hand squeezing his. "He was also the man who saved my nephew's life." A murmur rippled through the audience. Jimmy leaned forward, his full attention on the two people before him. "My sister's boy, Timothy, he was only 17. Had a heart condition nobody knew about. Collapsed during a school assembly." Dolly's voice cracked. "Bobby was the only one who knew CPR. Kept him alive until the ambulance came." Robert spoke for the first time to the wider audience. "I didn't know who he was connected to at first. Just knew he was a kid who needed help." His voice was soft but clear. Dolly came to the hospital that night. She'd been 3 hours away, but she drove through a storm to get there. "He lived," Dolly said, tears flowing freely now. "Because of Bobby, Timothy lived. He's 67 years old now. Has grandchildren. All because this man knew what to do." Jimmy's eyes were glistening. Around the studio, audience members were openly crying. The Roots, visible in the background, sat motionless, absorbing this story. "I tried to find ways to thank him," Dolly continued. "Tried to get him tickets to shows, tried to help with his music program. But Bobby..." She smiled through her tears. "Bobby always said no. It wasn't about that," Robert said simply. "Never was. But I made him promise me something," Dolly said, turning to look at Robert directly. "I told him that someday, when I was old and gray, he should come to one of my shows. Not backstage. Not as a VIP. Just come, sit in the audience, and let me see that he was okay. That life had been good to him." 50 years, Jimmy said softly. 50 years, Robert confirmed. "I kept waiting for the right moment. Kept thinking maybe next year, maybe the year after. Then I turned 79 last month, and I thought, if not now, when?" The moment hung there, suspended in time. And then Dolly did something that would become the defining image of Jimmy Fallon's career. She stood, pulling Robert up with her. Then, in front of 300 studio audience members and millions who would watch later, she unbuttoned her guitar strap from the vintage Martin D28 and placed it in Robert's hands. "This guitar," she said, her voice stronger now, "has been with me for 40 years. It's been on more stages than I can count. But it started its life in East Tennessee, just like us. And I want you to have it." Robert's hands shook as he held the instrument. "Dolly, I can't. You saved my nephew's life," she said firmly. "You taught music to kids who nobody else believed in. You kept a promise for 50 years. She smiled. "You can and you will." Jimmy, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. His voice was thick with emotion. "Robert," he said, "would you play something?" The elderly man looked at the guitar in his hands, then at Dolly, then at the expectant faces of the audience. Slowly, carefully, he sat back down. His arthritic fingers found the strings, and after a moment of adjustment, he began to play. It was "Coat of Many Colors," Dolly's signature song, the one about being poor but loved, about a mother's devotion and a child's pride. His playing was simple, occasionally hesitant, but it carried a lifetime of love for the music. And then Dolly began to sing. Not the polished performance version. The real version, the one that came from the mountain girl she'd been before the fame, before the business empire, before the legend. It was raw and imperfect and absolutely transcendent. By the second verse, the audience had joined in. By the third, the Roots had picked up their instruments and were playing softly behind them. Jimmy stood to the side, conducting nothing, controlling nothing, simply bearing witness to something that transcended television. When the song ended, the applause began. It wasn't polite. It wasn't performative. It was the sound of 300 people who had just witnessed something holy. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 3 weeks later, Jimmy Fallon posted a photo on Instagram. It showed Robert Chen's living room in Queens, the Martin D28 guitar displayed on the wall, next to a framed photo of him and Dolly from that night. The caption was simple. Some promises take 50 years to keep. Some gifts last forever. Some nights remind you why we do this. The Tonight Show received over 10,000 letters about that episode. But the one that mattered most was written in careful handwriting on lined paper. It was from Timothy, Dolly's nephew, the boy whose life had been saved in 1974. "Thank you for letting the world see what real kindness looks like," he wrote. "Mr. Chen never wanted recognition. But I'm glad he finally got it." As for Jimmy Fallon, he keeps something in his desk drawer now, something that wasn't there before that March night. It's a guitar pick, given to him by Robert Chen as he left the studio. On one side, it's blank. On the other, Robert had written in permanent marker, "Remember why it matters." On nights when the show feels routine, when the jokes don't land, when the machinery of television seems hollow, Jimmy opens that drawer. He holds that pick. And he remembers the night Dolly Parton stopped singing, the night protocol shattered, the night a flannel shirt teacher proved that true goodness needs no spotlight, but deserves one anyway. Some voices crack. Some promises keep. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to witness the moment when 50 years of quiet heroism finally gets its standing ovation.